What happens when a federal judge uses her position to humiliate a public servant, only to discover that true strength doesn't come from a gavel or a title? Margaret Sterling thought she could crush anyone who dared to challenge her worldview. But when she denied service to former Attorney General Patricia Valdez at an upscale restaurant, she triggered a chain of events that would expose the difference between authority and integrity. This isn't just about a refused meal or wounded pride. This is about a woman who transformed public humiliation into a masterclass on grace under fire, turning a moment of cruelty into a movement that would shake the very foundations of how we think about power, respect, and the courage to stand tall when the world expects you to crumble. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Meridian's, the kind of exclusive Georgetown restaurant where senators whispered deals over wine that cost more than most people's rent. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across mahogany tables, and the soft murmur of Washington's elite filled the air with the comfortable hum of privilege and power. It was the sort of place where your name carried more weight than your credit card, where reservations were currency and recognition was everything. Patricia Valdez approached the hostess stand with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked into hostile rooms her entire career. As the former Attorney General, she was no stranger to scrutiny, but tonight she simply wanted a peaceful dinner with her longtime friend and advisor, Marcus Chen. She wore a simple black dress, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, radiating the understated authority that had defined her decades of public service. The hostess, a young woman named Sophie with nervous eyes and trembling hands, checked her reservation list twice before offering a hesitant smile. Patricia noticed the girl's discomfort, but attributed it to the usual jitters that came with working in such a high-pressure environment. What she didn't see was the intense conversation happening in the corner booth near the kitchen, where Judge Margaret Sterling sat with her dinner companions, her dark eyes fixed on Patricia with unmistakable contempt. Margaret Sterling was everything. Patricia was not. Theatrical where Patricia was measured, vindictive where Patricia was principled, and utterly convinced that her federal judgeship made her untouchable. She had spent years watching Patricia's career with growing resentment, seeing in the former Attorney General everything she believed was wrong with modern politics. Tonight, with 3 glasses of expensive Bordeaux coursing through her system, and an audience of sycophants hanging on her every word, Margaret saw an opportunity. She rose from her table with the predatory grace of someone who had never been denied anything, her silk scarf flowing behind her like a cape. The restaurant seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere as conversations dimmed and eyes turned to follow her purposeful stride across the dining room. Marcus Chen, deep in conversation with Patricia about education reform, noticed the change first, his expression shifting from relaxed engagement to alert concern. Margaret reached the hostess stand just as Sophie was preparing to escort Patricia and Marcus to their table. The judge's voice cut through the ambient noise with surgical precision, each word delivered with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow this woman to dine in the same establishment as myself and my guests." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's face went ashen as she looked between the federal judge and the former Attorney General, clearly understanding that whatever happened next would define not just this evening, but possibly her career. Other diners turned in their seats, phones emerging from purses and pockets as the significance of the moment began to dawn on them. Patricia's reaction was everything Margaret had not expected. There was no outrage, no demand to speak to a manager, no theatrical display of wounded pride. Instead, Patricia simply nodded, her expression remaining calm and thoughtful, as if she were considering a particularly interesting legal brief. Marcus stepped closer, his protective instincts flaring. But Patricia placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent signal that she would handle this herself. "I understand," Patricia said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed restaurant. "Thank you for making your position clear, Your Honor." The formal address carried no sarcasm, no edge of mockery, just the simple courtesy that Patricia extended to everyone, regardless of how they treated her. Margaret had expected a fight, a confrontation that would allow her to flex her judicial authority and publicly humiliate someone she viewed as a political enemy. Instead, she found herself facing a woman who refused to play the role of victim, who met cruelty with dignity and hatred with grace. The audience that Margaret had hoped would witness Patricia's downfall instead watched as the former Attorney General gathered her coat with unhurried movements, her composure unshaken. But Margaret wasn't finished. Emboldened by Patricia's apparent acquiescence and the attention of the room, she pressed further. "Perhaps you'll think twice before showing your face in places where decent people gather," she said, her voice rising just enough to ensure everyone could hear. "Some of us still believe in accountability." It was then that Patricia turned back, not with anger, but with something far more powerful. The quiet strength of someone who had spent her life fighting for justice and had nothing left to prove. "Your Honor," she said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the restaurant, "I've always believed that how we treat those we disagree with says more about us than how we treat our friends. I hope you have a pleasant evening." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and suddenly the power dynamic in the room shifted. Margaret, who had intended to humiliate Patricia, found herself exposed under the weight of her own cruelty. The silence stretched until someone in the back of the restaurant began to clap, slowly at first, then joined by others until a wave of applause filled the space. Patricia didn't acknowledge the applause. She simply walked toward the door with Marcus beside her, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. The complete dismantling of a bully's power through nothing more than grace and dignity. Outside, the Georgetown streets gleamed with rain, and Patricia stood for a moment under the restaurant's awning, breathing in the cool, night air. Marcus watched her carefully, searching for signs of the hurt he knew she must be feeling. "Patricia," he began, but she shook her head. "It's all right, Marcus," she said, though her voice carried a note of sadness. "Sometimes the measure of our character isn't found in how we're treated, but in how we respond when we're tested." Neither of them could have predicted that within hours, the confrontation would be replaying across every social media platform. In the country, a diner with a keen eye for drama had captured the entire exchange on video, and by midnight, #DiggInITY over drama was trending nationwide. The footage showed everything: Margaret's initial aggression, Patricia's composed response, and the moment when the former Attorney General's quiet strength turned a moment of intended humiliation into a masterclass in grace under pressure. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Margaret's supporters praised her for standing up to corrupt politicians, while Patricia's defenders hailed her response as a perfect example of how to maintain dignity in the face of unjust treatment. But something deeper was happening in the comments and shares, something that transcended political divisions. People were responding not just to the political implications of the confrontation, but to the human drama of watching someone choose grace over retaliation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Sarah Williams, a professor of ethics at Georgetown University, was among the first public figures to weigh in. "What we witnessed tonight," she wrote in a viral Twitter thread, "was not politics. It was a clinic in how to maintain one's integrity when faced with baseless hostility." Patricia Valdez showed us that true power doesn't come from the ability to humiliate others, but from the strength to rise above attempts at humiliation. The story spread beyond social media into mainstream news, with networks scrambling to book interviews and pundits preparing their takes. But Patricia remained silent, returning to her apartment in DuPont Circle and declining all requests for comment. Her silence only added to the intrigue, as journalists and commentators tried to interpret what her next move might be. Margaret Sterling, meanwhile, found herself facing a very different kind of attention. Legal analysts began questioning whether her behavior violated judicial conduct standards, and several ethics experts called for an investigation. The federal judiciary's code of conduct requires judges to avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety, and Margaret's public confrontation with a former government official was being scrutinized through that lens. The morning after the incident, Patricia's phone rang incessantly. Reporters camped outside her building, and interview requests flooded her assistant's email. Through it all, Patricia maintained the same measured calm she had shown at the restaurant. She declined every interview request with a polite but firm statement, "I have nothing to add to what was already witnessed." Her silence spoke volumes, but it also created a vacuum that others rushed to fill. Talk show hosts debated whether she should have responded more forcefully. Political strategists analyzed the implications for her future career prospects. Social media influencers dissected every frame of the video, looking for hidden meanings and subtle expressions. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source: young people across the country who saw in Patricia's composure a different model of strength. High school students began sharing the video with captions about standing up to bullies without becoming one. College students discussed it in ethics classes and debate societies. The phrase Valdez-level dignity entered the lexicon as shorthand for maintaining one's principles under pressure. 3 days after the restaurant incident, Patricia received a letter that would change everything. It came from Rebecca Martinez, a high school senior in Phoenix who had watched the video during what she described as the worst week of my life. Rebecca was being bullied at school by classmates who had discovered her family's immigration status, and she had been ready to give up on her dreams of college and a legal career. "Watching you that night," Rebecca wrote in careful script, "I realized that I don't have to let other people's hatred define me. You showed me that dignity isn't something that can be taken away, it's something we choose to keep. Thank you for helping me find my strength." The letter arrived on the same day that Margaret Sterling held her first and only press conference about the incident. Standing behind a podium at the federal courthouse, flanked by supporters and legal advisors, Margaret attempted to reframe the narrative. "I acted within my rights as a private citizen," she declared. "In a democracy, we have the freedom to choose our associations and to express our views, even when they make others uncomfortable." The press conference was a disaster. Margaret's attempt to cast herself as a defender of free speech fell flat when reporters pressed her on whether she would make the same choice again. Her evasive answers and defensive posture only reinforced the narrative that she had acted inappropriately. When one reporter asked if she felt any regret about the incident, Margaret's response, "I regret nothing," provided the soundbite that would define her role in the story. Patricia watched the press conference from her office, where she had been quietly returning to her work as a partner at a prestigious law firm. She felt no satisfaction in Margaret's struggles, only a deep sadness at how the judge's inability to acknowledge wrongdoing had compounded the original harm. It was then that Patricia made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. The Georgetown Community Center was packed beyond capacity on the Thursday evening, when Patricia Valdez made her first public appearance since the restaurant incident. She had chosen the venue deliberately, not a television studio or hotel ballroom, but a simple community space where local residents gathered to discuss neighborhood issues and plan charitable events. Patricia stepped to the modest podium without fanfare, facing an audience that included everyone from concerned citizens to curious reporters. She wore the same black dress she had worn to the restaurant, a subtle signal that she was not trying to reinvent herself or distance herself from what had happened. "I've been asked many times this week to respond to what happened at Meridian's," she began, her voice carrying easily through the packed room. I've declined those requests because I believed my actions spoke for themselves. But I've realized that silence, while sometimes powerful, can also be a form of abandonment. She paused, looking out at the faces before her, young and old, diverse in background, but united in their attention. I'm not here to relitigate what happened or to defend my response. I'm here because I've received hundreds of letters and messages from people who saw something in that moment that spoke to their own struggles with dignity, respect, and the choice between retaliation and grace. Patricia reached into her jacket and pulled out Rebecca Martinez's letter, holding it carefully as if it were made of glass. A young woman named Rebecca wrote to tell me that watching that evening helped her find strength in her own difficult situation. She reminded me that our actions ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control, touching lives we may never know about. The room was absolutely silent, everyone leaning forward to catch every word. Patricia continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. I want to be clear about something. What happened that evening was wrong. Not illegal, perhaps, but wrong. We live in a democracy where people have the right to express their views and make their choices, but we also live in a society where we have a responsibility to treat each other with basic human dignity. She folded Rebecca's letter carefully and returned it to her pocket. Judge Sterling was within her legal rights to have me removed from that restaurant. But legal rights and moral responsibilities are not always the same thing. The question we must ask ourselves is not what we have the right to do, but what we have the obligation to do as members of a shared community. A reporter in the back raised his hand, but Patricia shook her head gently. This isn't a press conference, she said. This is a conversation about who we choose to be when we think no one is watching, and who we choose to be when everyone is. Patricia's words that night would be quoted and analyzed for weeks to come, but their immediate impact was felt in the room itself. As she spoke about the difference between power and authority, between retaliation and justice, between silence and dignity, something shifted in the audience. People began to see the restaurant incident not as a political confrontation, but as a moral teaching moment. When Patricia finished speaking, she didn't take questions from the media. Instead, she opened the floor to anyone in the community who wanted to share their own experiences with dignity under pressure. What followed was extraordinary, a spontaneous forum where people shared stories of workplace harassment, family conflicts, and social discrimination, all filtered through the lens of choosing grace over grudges. An elderly man named Thomas spoke about caring for his wife with dementia while facing judgment from family members who thought he should put her away. A young teacher named Maria shared her experience of being criticized by parents who disagreed with her curriculum while maintaining professionalism and compassion. A veteran named David described returning from deployment to find that some neighbors viewed him with suspicion and fear, and how he chose understanding over anger. Each story reinforced Patricia's central message, that dignity is not a luxury for those who are never tested, but a choice available to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. The evening ended not with applause, but with a sense of shared understanding, as if the community had collectively discovered something important about itself. The video of Patricia's community center appearance went viral, but in a different way than the restaurant footage. This time, people shared it not for the drama, but for the wisdom. Teachers used it in classrooms to discuss conflict resolution. Therapists recommended it to clients struggling with workplace difficulties. Parents showed it to teenagers dealing with social media bullying. Margaret Sterling watched the video from her chambers, and for the first time since the restaurant incident, she felt something she hadn't expected: doubt. Patricia's words about the difference between legal rights and moral responsibilities echoed in her mind, forcing her to confront questions she had been avoiding. Had she acted within her rights? Yes. Had she acted rightly? That was a much more difficult question to answer. The doubt grew over the following days as Margaret faced increasing pressure from judicial conduct boards and ethics committees. Several legal organizations called for her resignation, while others defended her right to express her personal views. The controversy showed no signs of abating, and Margaret found herself trapped in a narrative where she was increasingly cast as the villain in a story about grace triumphing over grudges. It was during this period of mounting pressure that Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She reached out to Patricia through intermediaries, requesting a private meeting. The request was unusual. Judges and former attorneys general don't typically seek personal reconciliation after public confrontations, but Patricia agreed, curious about what Margaret hoped to accomplish. They met at a small coffee shop in Alexandria, far from the cameras and crowds that had surrounded them both since the restaurant incident. Margaret arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately. When Patricia entered, Margaret was struck by how unchanged she seemed, no signs of stress or anger, just the same quiet dignity that had been so evident in their previous encounter. Patricia sat down across from Margaret without ceremony, declining the judge's offer to buy her coffee. For a moment, neither woman spoke, the weight of their public confrontation hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said finally, her voice lacking its usual judicial authority. "I wasn't sure you would." Patricia studied Margaret's face, noting the fatigue and uncertainty that hadn't been there at the restaurant. "I'm curious about what you hope to accomplish," she said simply. Margaret looked down at her untouched coffee, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound like excuses or justifications. "I've been thinking about what you said at the community center," she admitted, "about the difference between having the right to do something and it being the right thing to do." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Patricia asked her, tone neutral but not unkind. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with admissions that went against everything she had claimed publicly. "I think," she said slowly, "that I may have confused power with righteousness. I had the authority to have you removed from that restaurant, but I'm beginning to question whether having that authority made using it justified." It was a significant admission, and Patricia recognized the courage it took to make it. "What? Changed your mind?" she asked. Margaret's answer surprised them both. "The letters," she said. "Hundreds of them, from people telling me how disappointed they were, not angry disappointed, as if they had expected better from me." She paused, her voice growing softer. "And watching your response. You had every right to be furious, to demand an apology, to use what happened for your own benefit, but you didn't. You chose something harder." Patricia leaned back in her chair, considering Margaret's words. "Anger would have been easier," she admitted, "but anger rarely changes anything. It just creates more heat without generating light." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging from their personal philosophies to their professional experiences to their hopes for how the country might heal its divisions. It wasn't a reconciliation in any dramatic sense. Too much had happened for that, but it was something rarer, a genuine dialogue between two people who had been cast as enemies but discovered they shared more common ground than either had expected. When they parted, Margaret asked Patricia a question that had been weighing on her mind. "If you could do it again, would you change anything about how you responded that night?" Patricia considered the question carefully. "I would have spoken to you privately first," she said. "I think there might have been a way to address your concerns without the public spectacle. But as for how I responded once the confrontation became public, no, I wouldn't change that." Margaret nodded, understanding the distinction. "I wish I had made different choices," she said quietly. "All of them." The coffee shop meeting remained private. Neither woman spoke publicly about it, but its effects were visible in the days that followed. Margaret announced that she would be taking a leave of absence to reflect on recent events and consider How to better serve the principles of justice and dignity that our judicial system represents. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Patricia, meanwhile, found herself in an unexpected position. The restaurant incident and its aftermath had transformed her from a respected but relatively private figure into something approaching a cultural icon. Invitations poured in from universities, community organizations, and civic groups, all wanting her to speak about dignity, grace, and conflict resolution. She accepted some of these invitations, but with careful consideration. Patricia had no desire to become a professional victim or to build a career on a single moment of public humiliation. Instead, she chose opportunities where she could contribute to meaningful conversations about how communities could handle disagreement and conflict more constructively. Her approach was always the same: focus on principles rather than personalities, on building understanding rather than winning arguments. She never spoke directly about Margaret Sterling, always redirecting conversations toward broader themes of civic responsibility and mutual respect. The strategy was effective. Patricia's measured response to the restaurant incident became a case study in crisis management, taught in business schools and public administration programs. Her refusal to capitalize on the controversy for personal gain only enhanced her reputation for integrity. But perhaps more importantly, Patricia's response resonated with ordinary people facing their own struggles with dignity and respect. The letters continued to arrive from students dealing with bullying, from employees facing discrimination, from community members navigating neighborhood conflicts. Each letter reinforced Patricia's belief that how we treat each other in moments of disagreement shapes the kind of society we become. 6 months after the restaurant incident, Patricia received an invitation that brought the story full circle. Rebecca Martinez, the high school senior from Phoenix whose letter had prompted Patricia's first public response, was graduating as valedictorian and wanted Patricia to speak at her commencement ceremony. Patricia accepted immediately, recognizing the profound symmetry of the moment. The young woman who had found strength in Patricia's example was now ready to take her own place in the world, armed with lessons about dignity and resilience that would serve her throughout her life. The commencement speech Patricia delivered that day was different from her other public appearances since the restaurant incident. Standing before hundreds of graduates and their families, she spoke not about conflict and controversy but about hope and possibility. 6 months ago, she began, I experienced what many of you will face in your own lives, a moment when someone tried to diminish me based on their own fears and prejudices. I had a choice in how to respond, and that choice defined not just that moment but every moment that followed. She looked out at the sea of young faces, seeing in them the future she was helping to shape. You will face similar moments, times when people underestimate you, dismiss you, or try to make you smaller than you are. In those moments, remember that you get to choose who you become. You can choose bitterness or grace, retaliation or dignity, division or understanding. Patricia's voice grew stronger as she reached the heart of her message. The person who tried to humiliate me that night gave me an unexpected gift, the opportunity to discover that my dignity belongs to me alone. No one can take it away unless I give it away, and I choose not to give it away. The applause that followed was different from the polite recognition typically offered at graduation ceremonies. It was the sound of people understanding something important about themselves and their own capacity for grace under pressure. After the ceremony, Rebecca Martinez approached Patricia with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Patricia hugged the young woman tightly, seeing in her the reason why the difficult months since the restaurant incident had been worthwhile. "Thank you," she replied, "for reminding me that our actions matter more than we know." As Patricia flew back to Washington that evening, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from a humiliating moment in a Georgetown restaurant to a triumphant celebration of young potential in Phoenix. The path had been difficult, marked by public scrutiny and private soul-searching. But it had led to something she hadn't anticipated, a deeper understanding of her own purpose and power. The restaurant incident would continue to be discussed and analyzed, cited in academic papers, and referenced in political debates. But for Patricia, its real significance lay not in what it revealed about American politics or social divisions, but in what it demonstrated about the human capacity for grace, growth, and redemption. She thought about Margaret Sterling, who had chosen to step back from public life rather than double down on her mistakes. She thought about Rebecca Martinez and the thousands of other young people who had found inspiration in a simple choice to respond to hatred with dignity. She thought about the community members who had shared their own stories of choosing grace over grudges. Most of all, she thought about the letter in her jacket pocket, not Rebecca's original message, but a new one from a teacher in Montana who had used Patricia's story to help her students understand that strength isn't about the absence of vulnerability, but about choosing how to respond when vulnerability is exposed. The plane descended through the clouds toward Reagan National Airport, and Patricia could see the lights of the Capitol spreading out below her. Somewhere in that vast constellation of lives and stories were people making choices about how to treat each other, how to respond to conflict, how to maintain their dignity in a world that often seemed determined to strip it away. Patricia smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that grace and strength were not opposites but allies. The restaurant incident had ended months ago, but the real story, the story of how communities choose to handle disagreement and how individuals choose to respond to hatred, was just beginning. And in that beginning lay infinite possibility. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Hart Senate office building as Senator Catherine Walsh reviewed the stack of newspaper clippings her chief of staff had placed on her desk. Every major publication had covered the restaurant incident, and the editorial pages were ablaze with commentary from both sides of the political spectrum. Catherine had worked alongside Patricia Valdez for years during her tenure as Attorney General, and she recognized something that the pundits were missing. Patricia's silence wasn't strategic calculation. It was authentic grace under fire. Catherine picked up her secure phone and dialed Patricia's private number, knowing that her former colleague would be inundated with calls, but hoping she might answer for an old friend. The phone rang twice before Patricia's familiar voice came through, calm and measured despite the chaos surrounding her. "Catherine," Patricia said warmly, "I was wondering when you'd call." "I've been watching this circus unfold," Catherine replied, settling back in her leather chair. "How are you holding up?" "Really holding up, not the official answer you've been giving everyone else." There was a pause, and Catherine could hear the weight of the past week in Patricia's silence. "It's been challenging," Patricia admitted. "Finally, not the incident itself. I've faced worse in my career. It's the aftermath. Everyone wants to turn this into something bigger than it was." Catherine understood immediately. "They want to make you a symbol instead of letting you be a person." "Exactly," Patricia said, relief evident in her voice at being understood. "I responded the way I did because it felt right in the moment, not because I was thinking about viral videos or political implications. Now everyone wants to dissect every word, every gesture, looking for hidden meanings that simply aren't there." Catherine had known Patricia long enough to recognize the frustration beneath her composed exterior. "What's next for you? The invitations must be pouring in." Patricia walked to her apartment window, looking out at the morning traffic on Connecticut Avenue. "They are universities, think tanks, community organizations. Marcus thinks I should capitalize on the moment, use it to build a platform for the issues I care about. But that feels like I'd be profiting from Margaret Sterling's mistake, and that doesn't sit right with me." "What does feel right?" Catherine asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter in the way that had made her such an effective senator. Patricia considered the question carefully. helping people understand that dignity isn't a political position. It's a human choice. When I spoke at the community center, I saw something in people's faces, recognition, maybe, or relief. As if they'd been looking for permission to choose grace over anger in their own lives. Catherine made a note on her calendar. There's something I want to run by you. The Georgetown Law Center has been developing a new program on civil discourse and democratic norms. They need someone to head it up, someone who understands both the theoretical frameworks and the practical challenges. Your name came up before any of this restaurant business happened. The offer hung in the air between them, representing a path forward that neither capitalized on the controversy nor ignored it entirely. Patricia felt something stir within her that she hadn't experienced since leaving the Attorney General's office. Genuine excitement about a new challenge. "Tell me more," she said, settling into the chair by her window. Catherine outlined the program, which would bring together students, faculty, and practitioners to explore how democratic societies could maintain civil discourse across deep ideological divides. It would involve teaching, research, and community engagement, but most importantly, it would focus on practical solutions rather than theoretical abstractions. "The timing is interesting," Catherine noted. "After what happened at the restaurant, you've become a real-world case study in the principles the program would be teaching. Not because you sought that role, but because circumstances thrust it upon you." Patricia found herself nodding as Catherine spoke. This felt different from the speaking engagements and interviews she'd been declining. This was about building something constructive, about turning a difficult experience into a foundation for helping others navigate similar challenges. "I'm interested," Patricia said finally. "When can we set up a meeting?" While Patricia was exploring new possibilities in Washington, Margaret Sterling was facing a very different reality in her chambers at the federal courthouse. The judicial conduct investigation had been proceeding quietly but thoroughly, and Margaret's attorney had just delivered news that would fundamentally alter her career trajectory. "They're not recommending removal," Attorney David Thornton explained, setting down the thick folder of documentation they'd assembled for Margaret's defense. "But they are recommending formal censure and mandatory ethics training. More importantly, they're suggesting you consider whether a leave of absence might be appropriate while the controversy dies down." Margaret sat behind her massive oak desk, the weight of her judicial robes feeling heavier than usual. The office that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a prison, every knock on the door bringing another unwelcome development in the ongoing fallout from her confrontation with Patricia. "A leave of absence," she repeated, tasting the words like medicine. "For how long?" David's expression was grim. "That would be up to you, but I'd recommend at least 6 months. Maybe longer. The media attention shows no signs of abating, and every case you hear now gets scrutinized through the lens of the restaurant incident. That's not fair to the litigants or to you." Margaret turned to look out her window at the courthouse steps, where she could see a small group of protesters with signs calling for her resignation. They'd been there every day for 2 weeks, a constant reminder of how quickly her life had changed. "What happens to my cases?" "They'll be reassigned," David said gently. "Judge Harrison has already volunteered to take the most pressing ones. The administrative office has been planning for this possibility." The conversation continued for another hour, covering the legal and practical implications of a leave of absence, but Margaret's mind kept drifting to her coffee shop meeting with Patricia. The former Attorney General's grace in that private moment had been even more striking than her public composure, and it had forced Margaret to confront uncomfortable truths about her own motivations and behavior. That evening, Margaret sat in her study at home, drafting the letter that would formalize her decision to step away from the bench temporarily. The words came slowly, each sentence a small acknowledgement of failure and an uncertain hope for redemption. After careful consideration and consultation with judicial conduct authorities, she wrote, I have decided to take a leave of absence from my duties as a federal judge to engage in serious reflection about my recent actions and their impact on public confidence in the judiciary. She paused, knowing that the next sentences would define how her decision was perceived. I recognize that my behavior at Meridian's restaurant fell short of the standards expected of a federal judge, not because it was illegal, but because it failed to demonstrate the dignity and respect that should characterize all of our interactions with fellow citizens. Margaret set down her pen and walked to the window, looking out at the tree-lined street where she'd lived for 15 years. Tomorrow, her letter would be released to the media, and she would begin the difficult process of rebuilding her reputation. And more importantly, her understanding of herself. Across town, Patricia was having dinner with Marcus Chun at a small Vietnamese restaurant in DuPont Circle, the kind of modest establishment where they could talk freely without being recognized or overhead. Marcus had been Patricia's closest advisor for over a decade, and she valued his perspective even when they disagreed. "The Georgetown offer is intriguing," Marcus said, expertly wielding his chopsticks as he spoke. "It gives you a platform without making you a professional victim. But I still think you're underestimating the political capital you've built from this incident." Patricia sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Political capital for what purpose? I'm not running for office again, and I don't want to become a talking head on cable news shows. What I want is to help people understand that we can disagree without demonizing each other." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "That's exactly my point. You've become a symbol of principled leadership in a time when that's in short supply. The Georgetown program is fine, but imagine what you could accomplish with a broader platform. Think tanks, media appearances, speaking engagements at major events. You could influence national conversations about civility and democracy." "By becoming a celebrity?" Patricia asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's not who I am, Marcus. I've always been more effective working behind the scenes, building consensus rather than commanding attention." Their conversation was interrupted by a young woman approaching their table hesitantly, clearly debating whether to intrude. Patricia noticed her first and smiled encouragingly, having learned to recognize the expression of someone wrestling with whether to share something important. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice nervous but determined. "I'm Sarah Kim, and I'm a first-year law student at GW. I just wanted to thank you for how you handled that situation at the restaurant. My grandmother immigrated here from Korea in the 1960s, and she faced a lot of discrimination. She always told me to respond to hatred with dignity, but I never really understood what that meant until I saw your video." Patricia stood and shook Sarah's hand warmly. "Thank you for telling me that, Sarah. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Sarah said, her eyes bright with emotion. "She died last year, but watching how you responded to Judge Sterling, I felt like I finally understood what she was trying to teach me. That's the kind of lawyer I want to be." After Sarah returned to her table, Marcus looked at Patricia with a knowing expression. "That's why you need a bigger platform," he said quietly. "Imagine how many more people you could reach, how many more conversations you could inspire." Patricia considered his words as they finished their meal, but her instincts still pulled her toward the more intimate work of teaching and mentoring rather than the broader stage of national politics. The Georgetown program would allow her to influence the next generation of leaders, while maintaining the authentic relationships that had always been the source of her greatest satisfaction. The following week, Patricia met with Dean Elizabeth Harper at Georgetown Law to discuss the civil discourse program in detail. Dean Harper was a distinguished scholar of constitutional law who had spent years thinking about the challenges facing democratic institutions in an era of increasing polarization. "What we're proposing," Dean Harper explained as they walked through the law school's historic halls, "is something that doesn't exist anywhere else. A program that combines rigorous academic study with real-world application. Students would study the theoretical foundations of democratic discourse, but they'd also work with community organizations, local governments, and civic groups to practice what they learn. Patricia was immediately drawn to the practical emphasis. How would that work in practice? Students would spend 1 day a week in placements around the city, Dean Harper continued. Neighborhood associations dealing with zoning disputes, school boards navigating curriculum controversies, community organizations working on housing issues. They'd learn to facilitate difficult conversations, mediate conflicts, and build consensus across ideological divides. They paused in front of a classroom where a constitutional law seminar was in session. Students engaged in animated but respectful debate about the scope of executive power. Patricia watched for a moment, remembering her own law school days and the idealism that had driven her toward public service. "What role would I play?" Patricia asked. "You'd be the program's founding director," Dean Harper said. "You'd design the curriculum, recruit faculty, and most importantly, you'd teach. We're thinking of offering a clinic where students would work on actual community mediation cases under your supervision." The proposal was compelling, combining Patricia's legal expertise with her recent experience navigating public controversy. More importantly, it would allow her to work directly with young people at a formative stage of their careers, helping them develop the skills and values that would serve them throughout their professional lives. "I need some time to think about it," Patricia said, though her excitement was evident. "This feels like it could be exactly what I'm looking for." That afternoon, Patricia drove to Arlington National Cemetery, a place she often visited when she needed clarity about important decisions. She walked slowly among the white headstones, thinking about the generations of Americans who had served their country in different ways and different times. She paused at the grave of General Colin Powell, whose example of principled leadership had always inspired her. Powell had faced his own share of public controversies and mistakes, but he had consistently chosen to focus on service rather than self-justification. Patricia found herself wondering what he would have done in her situation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Martinez, the high school senior from Phoenix whose letter had prompted Patricia's first public appearance after the restaurant incident. "Ms. Valdez," the message read, "I got into Harvard. My acceptance letter mentioned my essay about dignity and leadership, which was inspired by watching your video. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." Patricia smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. This was why her response to Margaret Sterling mattered, not because of the political implications or media coverage, but because it had helped a young person find strength and direction. She typed back quickly, "Congratulations, Rebecca. Harvard is lucky to have you. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do the right thing despite the fear." As Patricia walked back to her car, her decision about Georgetown crystallized. The program would allow her to work with many more young people like Rebecca, helping them develop the tools they would need to navigate an increasingly complex and divided world. It wasn't about capitalizing on her moment of viral fame. It was about using that moment as a foundation for something more lasting and meaningful. Meanwhile, Margaret Sterling was beginning her own journey of reflection and potential redemption. Her leave of absence had been announced to mixed reactions, with some calling it too little too late, while others saw it as a necessary step toward accountability. Margaret herself was relieved to step away from the daily pressures of the bench and the constant scrutiny of her every decision. She had enrolled in a judicial education program at Duke University, designed for judges who needed to address ethical concerns or simply refresh their understanding of judicial conduct standards. The program was intensive and humbling, requiring participants to examine their own biases and blind spots in ways that many found uncomfortable. On her first day, Margaret sat in a circle with 11 other judges from around the country, each dealing with their own professional challenges. The facilitator, a retired Supreme Court Justice named Robert Chen, began with a simple but profound question. Why did you become a judge? As they went around the circle, Margaret listened to her colleagues describe their motivations: a desire to serve justice, to protect the vulnerable, to uphold the rule of law. When her turn came, Margaret found herself struggling to articulate an answer that didn't sound hollow or self-serving. I became a judge because I believed in the power of law to create order and fairness, she said finally. But I'm here because I lost sight of the fact that law without compassion can become its own form of injustice. The admission surprised even Margaret herself, and she could see recognition in the eyes of her fellow participants. Over the following weeks, they would work together to examine cases where their personal biases had potentially influenced their judicial decisions, learning to recognize the difference between appropriate judicial authority and inappropriate personal prejudice. One evening, as Margaret reviewed the day's readings about implicit bias and judicial conduct, she found herself thinking about Patricia Valdez again. The more she learned about unconscious prejudice and its impact on decision-making, the clearer it became that her confrontation with Patricia had been driven by factors she hadn't fully acknowledged at the time. She had told herself that she was standing up for her principles, but the truth was more complicated. Patricia represented everything Margaret felt uncertain about in her own life: the ability to remain graceful under pressure, the confidence to make difficult decisions without second-guessing, the respect that came from consistent principled action rather than positional authority. Margaret had began writing in a journal, a practice encouraged by the program facilitators, as a way of processing difficult insights. I think I attacked Patricia Valdez, she wrote one night, not because of her politics or her record as Attorney General, but because she possessed qualities I wished I had. Her composure highlighted my own insecurity, and I lashed out rather than examine why her presence made me uncomfortable. The realization was painful, but liberating. For the first time since the restaurant incident, Margaret felt like she was beginning to understand not just what she had done wrong, but why she had done it. The path forward would require more than just avoiding similar mistakes. It would require fundamentally changing her relationship with power and her understanding of what it meant to serve justice. Back in Washington, Patricia was finalizing her decision about the Georgetown position. She had met with potential colleagues, toured the facilities, and most importantly, sat in on several classes to get a sense of the student body she would be working with. The students were bright, engaged, and hungry for guidance about how to navigate a legal profession that often seemed to reward confrontation over collaboration. During one class discussion about legal ethics, a student named Michael Rodriguez raised a question that struck Patricia as particularly insightful. "Professor Harper," he said, "we've been talking about the rules that govern lawyer conduct, but what about the unwritten rules? The expectations about how we treat opposing counsel, how we interact with the public, how we handle cases that generate media attention." Dean Harper turned to Patricia, who had been observing from the back of the classroom. "Miss Valdez, would you like to address that question? You've had some recent experience with the intersection of legal practice and public attention." Patricia stood and moved to the front of the classroom, immediately comfortable in the teaching environment. "That's an excellent question, Michael. The formal rules of professional conduct provide a framework, but they're just the beginning. The real test of a lawyer's character comes in the gray areas, the moments when you have to choose between what's technically permissible and what's right." She paused, making eye contact with students around the room. "Recently, I found myself in a situation where someone with legal authority chose to use that authority in a way that was technically within their rights, but ethically questionable. I had to decide how to respond, and I chose to prioritize dignity over retaliation." A student named Jennifer Lee raised her hand. "But didn't that let the other person off the hook? If you don't fight back against injustice, doesn't that enable it to continue?" Patricia nodded approvingly at the question. That's the tension every lawyer faces. How do you stand up for what's right, without becoming part of the problem? In my experience, the most lasting victories come from changing hearts and minds, not from escalating conflicts. The discussion continued for the rest of the class period, with students asking thoughtful questions about the balance between advocacy and civility, the role of lawyers in public discourse, and the challenges of maintaining professional standards. In an increasingly polarized environment, Patricia found herself energized by the conversation in a way she hadn't experienced in months. After class, Dean Harper walked with Patricia to the parking garage. The students were impressed, she said. You have a gift for making complex ethical issues accessible and relevant. I hope you'll seriously consider our offer. Patricia had already made her decision, but she appreciated the dean's patience in allowing her to process it fully. I'd like to accept, she said, but I have some conditions I'd like to discuss. Over coffee the next day, Patricia outlined her vision for the program. She wanted to ensure that it remained grounded in practical application rather than becoming an academic exercise. Students would work on real cases with real stakes, learning to navigate the messy realities of human conflict rather than just studying theoretical frameworks. I also want to establish partnerships with community organizations, Patricia said. Places where law students can see how legal principles play out in everyday life. Neighborhood councils, school boards, housing authorities. The goal should be to train lawyers who can build bridges, not just win arguments. Dean Harper was enthusiastic about Patricia's proposed additions to the program. That's exactly what we hoped you would bring to this role. Your recent experience has given you insights that pure academics can't provide. As they finalized the details of Patricia's appointment, news was breaking across town about Margaret Sterling's progress in the judicial education program. A legal journalist named Amanda Foster had obtained access to some of Margaret's assignments and reflections, painting a picture of a judge genuinely wrestling with her mistakes and working to understand their deeper causes. Judge Sterling's written work shows a level of self-examination that's rare in judicial conduct cases, Amanda reported on the evening news. Rather than simply going through the motions of mandatory training, she appears to be engaging seriously with questions about bias, power, and the proper role of judicial authority. The report included excerpts from Margaret's reflections on implicit bias and its impact on judicial decision-making, as well as her analysis of cases where she believed her personal views might have influenced her rulings. It was a portrait of someone committed to genuine change rather than merely managing a public relations crisis. Patricia watched the news report from her apartment, feeling a complex mix of emotions. She was glad to see that Margaret was taking responsibility for her actions and working to understand their causes. At the same time, Patricia couldn't help but wonder whether this public revelation of Margaret's private reflections was itself a form of exploitation, turning the judge's genuine growth into another media spectacle. The question of how to handle personal growth in the public eye would become increasingly relevant as Patricia prepared to launch her own new chapter at Georgetown. The program she would be directing would inevitably be seen through the lens of the restaurant incident, and she would need to find ways to acknowledge that reality while ensuring that the work itself remained focused on substance rather than symbolism. 2 weeks later, Patricia stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown Law for her first public lecture as the new director of the Center for Civil Discourse and Democratic Practice. The audience included students, faculty, local attorneys, and journalists, all curious to hear how she would frame her new role. Democracy is not a spectator sport, Patricia began, her voice carrying clearly through the large space. It requires active participation from all of us, and that participation must be grounded in mutual respect and good faith engagement with different perspectives. She spoke about the program's goals without dwelling on the restaurant incident, though its influence was clear in her emphasis on choosing grace over grievance, understanding over accusation. We will teach our students to be advocates without being adversaries, to fight for their principles without demonizing their opponents. The lecture was well received, but what struck Patricia most was a conversation afterward with a young woman named Lisa Patel, a first-year student who had been following Patricia's story closely. "Ms. Valdez," Lisa said, "I've been thinking about your response to Judge Sterling, and I keep coming back to one thing. You didn't just avoid escalating the conflict. You actually created space for her to reconsider her actions. Do you think that was intentional?" Patricia was struck by the insight behind the question. "I'm not sure it was entirely conscious at the time," she admitted. "But you're right that dignity can be disarming when you refuse to meet hostility. With hostility, it forces the other person to confront their own behavior rather than focus on defending against your attack." "That's what I want to learn," Lisa said earnestly. "How to be strong without being destructive, how to stand up for what's right without creating more division." As Patricia walked home that evening, she thought about Lisa's question and her own evolving understanding of what had happened at Meridian's restaurant. She had responded to Margaret's hostility with grace, not as a tactical choice, but as an expression of her deepest values. Yet the consequences of that choice had been far more strategic than any calculated response could have been. The irony wasn't lost on her. By refusing to play the game of public conflict, she had changed the rules of the game entirely. Margaret Sterling was now engaged in genuine self-reflection rather than defensive justification. The national conversation had shifted from political point-scoring to deeper questions about civility and respect. And Patricia herself had found a new platform for the work that mattered most to her. The restaurant incident was becoming a distant memory, but its lessons were shaping every aspect of Patricia's new role. As she prepared for the challenges ahead, teaching the next generation of lawyers how to navigate conflict with grace and effectiveness, she understood that the most important battles are often won not through confrontation, but through the quiet courage to remain true to one's principles, even when the stakes are high and the spotlight is bright. 3 months into her tenure at Georgetown, Patricia received an unexpected visitor. Margaret Sterling appeared at her office door one afternoon, looking nervous but determined. The two women hadn't spoken since their coffee shop meeting, and Patricia was surprised to see how much Margaret had changed during her time away from the bench. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from Patricia's desk. "I wanted to tell you about something that happened during my program at Duke, something I thought you should know." Patricia set aside the papers she'd been grading and gave Margaret her full attention. The former judge seemed different somehow, more grounded and less defensive than she had been during their previous encounters. "We had an exercise where we had to identify a case or situation where our personal biases might have affected our judgment," Margaret continued. "I wrote about our encounter at the restaurant, trying to understand why I acted the way I did. The facilitator asked me to consider what I could have learned if I had approached you with curiosity instead of hostility." Margaret paused, clearly struggling with the vulnerability required to continue. The answer was everything. "If I had been willing to listen instead of judge, to ask questions instead of making accusations, I might have learned something valuable about perspectives different from my own. Instead, I let my fears and insecurities drive my behavior." Patricia leaned forward, recognizing the courage it took for Margaret to make such admissions. "What did you discover about those fears and insecurities?" "That I was threatened by your composure because it highlighted my own lack of it," Margaret said quietly. "That I used my position to bully you because I felt powerless in other areas of my life. That I confused having authority with being right." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Margaret sharing insights from her months of reflection and Patricia listening with the same grace she had shown on that night at Meridian's. When Margaret finally prepared to leave, she had one more thing to say. I'm going to be returning to the bench next month, she said. The conduct board has approved my reinstatement, but I know I'll be watched closely. I wanted you to know that I'm committed to being the kind of judge I should have been all along, the kind who remembers that everyone who comes before me deserves dignity and respect. Patricia stood and extended her hand, which Margaret shook warmly. I'm glad to hear that, Margaret. The justice system needs judges who understand that their real power comes from serving justice, not from wielding authority. As Margaret left, Patricia reflected on how much both of their lives had changed since that difficult night 6 months earlier. The restaurant incident had ended one chapter of their stories and begun another, creating opportunities for growth and service that neither could have anticipated. The work at Georgetown was flourishing, with students responding enthusiastically to the program's emphasis on practical application and real-world problem-solving. Patricia's classes were consistently over-enrolled, and the community partnerships she had developed were providing valuable learning opportunities while also addressing genuine local needs. More importantly, Patricia could see the impact of the program's approach on her students' development. They were learning to approach legal problems with creativity and compassion, to see opposing parties as people with legitimate concerns rather than enemies to be defeated. The skills they were developing would serve them throughout their careers, making them more effective advocates and better citizens. As the semester drew to a close, Patricia prepared for the program's first annual symposium on civil discourse and democratic practice. The event would bring together students, faculty, practitioners, and community leaders to share insights and strategies for building more constructive approaches to conflict resolution. The symposium would also mark the end of Patricia's first year as director, a year that had transformed her from a private citizen dealing with public humiliation into a recognized leader in the field of civic education. The journey had been unexpected and sometimes difficult, but it had led her to work that felt more meaningful than anything she had done before. Standing in her office as the sun set over Georgetown, Patricia thought about the letter from Rebecca Martinez that had started her on this path, about Margaret Sterling's journey from hostility to humility, about the students who were learning to be advocates without being adversaries. The restaurant incident had ended in a matter of minutes, but its ripple effects would continue for years to come, shaping conversations about dignity, respect, and the possibility of grace even in the most difficult circumstances. The autumn morning brought an unexpected chill to Washington as Patricia Valdez walked across the Georgetown campus toward what would become one of the most significant events of her academic career. The first annual Civil Discourse Symposium was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, and the response had exceeded every expectation. Registration had closed weeks earlier with a waiting list of over 300 people, representing universities, law firms, community organizations, and government agencies from across the country. Patricia paused outside Gaston Hall, watching. As early attendees gathered on the steps, their conversations animated despite the early hour. She recognized faces from the legal community, academics she had read but never met, and students whose enthusiasm reminded her why she had chosen teaching over the more lucrative opportunities that had presented themselves after the restaurant incident. Dr. James Mitchell, the symposium's keynote speaker and a renowned expert on conflict resolution, approached with a warm smile. Patricia, I have to tell you, this is the most diverse audience I've ever addressed. You've managed to bring together people who rarely occupy the same room, let alone engage in productive dialogue. Patricia nodded, feeling both pride and apprehension about what the day would bring. That was the goal, but I'll admit I'm nervous about whether we can maintain the collaborative spirit once the discussions begin. Some of these perspectives are genuinely incompatible. That's exactly what makes this valuable, Dr. Mitchell replied. Real discourse doesn't happen between people who already agree. It happens when people with fundamental differences choose to engage respectfully despite those differences. Inside the auditorium, Patricia took her place at the moderator's table, looking out at an audience that represented the full spectrum of American legal and political thought. She spotted Margaret Sterling in the third row, a sight that still surprised her despite their recent conversations. The former judge had returned to the bench the previous month and had specifically requested to attend the symposium as part of her ongoing commitment to professional development. Patricia began the morning session with a simple but profound question. What would our democracy look like if we approached disagreement as an opportunity for learning rather than an occasion for combat? The question hung in the air as attendees considered its implications, and Patricia could sense the room's readiness to engage seriously with difficult topics. The first panel focused on the role of legal education in promoting civil discourse. Professor Sarah Chun from Yale argued that law schools had inadvertently created a generation of lawyers who viewed every interaction as a zero-sum competition. We teach our students to find weaknesses in opposing arguments rather than to look for common ground, she observed. The result is a profession that excels at winning but struggles with collaboration. A practicing attorney named Robert Daniels pushed back gently. But isn't our job to advocate zealously for our clients? If we're too focused on finding common ground, don't we risk compromising our duty to those we represent? The exchange that followed demonstrated exactly what Patricia had hoped to achieve: passionate but respectful disagreement that advanced understanding rather than simply reinforcing existing positions. Audience members began to see that zealous advocacy and respectful engagement weren't mutually exclusive, that one could fight hard for principles while maintaining dignity and courtesy. During the lunch break, Patricia noticed clusters of attendees continuing their conversations over meals, exchanging contact information, and making plans for future collaboration. The energy was infectious, and she began to see how the symposium could become the foundation for a broader network of practitioners committed to elevating the quality of public discourse. Margaret Sterling approached during the afternoon break, her expression thoughtful. "I've been listening to these discussions all day, and I keep thinking about our encounter at the restaurant. If I had approached you with even a fraction of the curiosity and respect I'm hearing today, everything would have been different." Patricia appreciated Margaret's continued reflection on their shared experience. "What strikes me about today is how much these conversations depend on people's willingness to be vulnerable, to admit when they don't know something or when they might be wrong. That's harder to do when you're in a position of authority." "Exactly," Margaret replied. "I think I confused being right with being powerful. Today I'm seeing people who are clearly experts in their fields acknowledge uncertainty and ask genuine questions. That takes a different kind of confidence." The afternoon's highlight was a panel on media and public discourse, featuring journalists, social media strategists, and communication experts. The discussion quickly turned to the role of viral moments in shaping public opinion, with Patricia's restaurant experience serving as an unspoken backdrop to the conversation. Amanda Foster, the journalist who had covered Margaret's judicial education program, raised a crucial point. "We've created a media ecosystem that rewards conflict and punishes nuance. The stories that go viral are almost always about confrontation, not collaboration. How do we change that dynamic?" A social media expert named David Kim offered a sobering perspective. "The algorithms that drive engagement are fundamentally designed to amplify content that provokes strong emotional reactions. Thoughtful, nuanced content simply doesn't perform as well in terms of shares and comments." Patricia found herself moderating a discussion that felt deeply personal, given how her own experience had been shaped by viral video and social media commentary. "What if we focused less on changing the algorithms and more on changing our own behavior?" she suggested. "What if we consciously chose to engage with content that challenges us thoughtfully rather than content that simply confirms our existing beliefs?" The suggestion sparked a lively debate about individual responsibility versus systemic change. with participants sharing strategies they had developed for maintaining thoughtful engagement in an environment designed to promote reactive responses. The conversation revealed a genuine hunger for alternatives to the current state of public discourse, with people actively seeking tools and frameworks for more constructive engagement. As the symposium drew to a close, Patricia delivered closing remarks that crystallized many of the day's themes. Today we've seen that it's possible for people with deep disagreements to engage respectfully and productively, she began. But we've also seen that this kind of engagement requires intentional effort. It doesn't happen by accident. She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with participants who had contributed meaningfully to the day's discussions. The question now is whether we can take what we've learned here and apply it in our daily work, our community involvement, and our personal relationships. Can we choose curiosity over certainty, understanding over victory, bridge building over wall building? The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but more importantly, the conversations continued long after the formal program ended. Attendees lingered in the auditorium and spilled out onto the campus, forming new connections and deepening existing relationships based on shared commitment to elevating public discourse. Rebecca Martinez, now a sophomore at Harvard, had traveled to Washington specifically to attend the symposium. She approached Patricia during the reception with tears in her eyes. "Watching today reminded me why I wanted to study law in the first place," she said. "Not to win arguments, but to solve problems. Not to defeat opponents, but to find solutions that work for everyone." Patricia hugged the young woman who had written the letter that changed everything. "You're going to be exactly the kind of lawyer the world needs," she said. "Keep that idealism alive, even when the profession tries to wear it down." The success of the symposium led to immediate requests for similar events at other universities, and Patricia found herself coordinating a national network of programs focused on civil discourse and democratic practice. The work was demanding, but deeply fulfilling, combining her legal expertise with her passion for public service in ways she had never anticipated. 6 months later, Patricia received a call that would provide the ultimate test of everything the symposium had represented. The caller was Chief Judge William Morrison, explaining that a high-profile case involving media law and First Amendment issues was creating significant public controversy. The case had already generated heated protests and inflammatory rhetoric from both sides, and Judge Morrison wondered whether Patricia's program might help facilitate a more constructive public conversation about the legal and constitutional issues at stake. "What we're seeing," Judge Morrison explained, "is the same pattern that plays out in every contentious case: immediate polarization, with each side claiming absolute moral authority and dismissing their opponents as either naive or malicious. The legal issues are complex and deserve serious consideration, but the public discourse has devolved into shouting matches." Patricia was intrigued by the possibility of applying the symposium's approach to an active legal controversy. "What did you have in mind?" "A series of public forums where legal experts, journalists, and community members could discuss the case's implications without the pressure of having to choose sides," Judge Morrison said. "Something that would help people understand the genuine constitutional tensions at play rather than just reinforcing their existing positions." The proposal was ambitious and risky. Patricia would be stepping directly into an ongoing controversy, with the potential for significant backlash, regardless of how carefully she managed the process. But the opportunity to demonstrate that constructive dialogue was possible, even around the most divisive issues, was too important to pass up. Patricia spent weeks designing a format that would encourage genuine engagement, while avoiding the pitfalls that typically derailed such discussions. She recruited moderators from different ideological perspectives, established ground rules that prioritized understanding over persuasion, and created small group discussions that would allow for more intimate conversation than large panel formats. typically permitted. The first forum was held at a neutral venue, the National Press Club, with participants including constitutional law professors, working journalists, First Amendment advocates, and community representatives from both sides of the underlying dispute. Patricia opened with a reminder that the goal was not to resolve the legal case, but to model how complex constitutional questions could be discussed respectfully and productively. "We're not here to determine who's right and who's wrong," she explained. "We're here to understand the legitimate concerns and values that underlie different perspectives on these issues. That understanding won't eliminate our disagreements, but it might help us disagree more constructively." The first session exceeded even Patricia's optimistic expectations. Participants who had been portrayed in media coverage as bitter enemies found common ground in their shared concern for constitutional principles, even as they maintained significant differences about how those principles should be applied. The discussion was substantive and serious, focusing on legal precedent, constitutional interpretation, and practical implications, rather than personal attacks or political point scoring. Margaret Sterling attended as an observer, having followed the forum's development with interest. During a break, she approached Patricia with a reflection that captured much of what made the forum successful. "What strikes me is how different this feels from typical legal arguments," she said. "In court, lawyers are trying to win. Here, people are trying to understand. That changes everything about the quality of the conversation." The forums continued monthly for the remainder of the legal case's progression through the courts, creating a parallel discourse that demonstrated how even the most contentious issues could be discussed with nuance and respect. Legal commentators began citing the forum's discussions as examples of thoughtful analysis, and several participants reported that their involvement had changed how they approached their own professional work. When the case was finally decided by the Supreme Court, the reaction was notably different from typical high-profile rulings. While people certainly disagreed with the outcome, the level of vitriol and personal attack was significantly lower than usual. Participants in Patricia's forums had developed relationships and understanding that made it harder to demonize those with different perspectives, even in the face of disappointing legal outcomes. The success of the forums led to Patricia being invited to consult on similar projects around the country. Law schools began incorporating her methods into their curricula. Bar associations requested training programs for their members and community. Organizations sought her guidance for local conflicts that had become entrenched and destructive. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. The American Bar Association announced that Patricia would receive its highest honor for public service, the Abia Medal, in recognition of her work promoting civil discourse and democratic values within the legal profession. The award ceremony was held in Chicago, with an audience that included many of the country's most prominent legal figures. As Patricia accepted the medal, she thought back to that night at Meridian's restaurant when Margaret Sterling had tried to humiliate her, never imagining that the incident would lead to work that would be recognized by her profession's highest authorities. "This award belongs not to me, but to everyone who has chosen dialogue over demagoguery, understanding over accusation, bridge building over wall building," Patricia said in her acceptance speech. "What we've learned is that civil discourse isn't a luxury for easier times. It's essential for democracy itself, especially when the stakes are highest and the disagreements are deepest." The speech was widely covered and shared, but Patricia was most moved by a private note she received afterward from a young lawyer named Michael Torres, who had participated in one of the early forums. "Watching you work has changed how I practice law," he wrote. "I still advocate zealously for my clients, but I've learned that zealous advocacy and respectful engagement aren't contradictory. In fact, they reinforce each other." As Patricia's second year at Georgetown began, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from a humiliating encounter at an upscale restaurant to national recognition for her contributions to democratic discourse. The work had been challenging and sometimes frustrating, requiring constant navigation between competing demands and conflicting expectations, but the impact was undeniable. Students who had completed her program were spreading its principles throughout their careers. Lawyers who had participated in her forums were applying its methods to their own cases and communities. Community organizations were using her conflict resolution techniques to address local disputes more constructively. Most importantly, a new generation of legal professionals was entering practice with a different understanding of what it meant to be an advocate. They understood that winning wasn't the only measure of success, that building bridges could be. As important as scoring points, that respect for opponents could coexist with zealous advocacy for clients. Margaret Sterling, now 2 years back on the bench, had become one of the program's most effective ambassadors. Her own transformation, from hostile judge to thoughtful jurist, served as a powerful example of how people could grow and change, even after making significant mistakes. She regularly spoke to Patricia's classes about the importance of humility and self-reflection in judicial decision-making. The most dangerous moment in a judge's career, she would tell students, is when you start believing that your position makes you infallible. The moment you stop questioning your own assumptions and biases is the moment you stop serving justice. The relationship between Patricia and Margaret had evolved into something neither could have predicted, a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to improving the legal system. They collaborated on articles about judicial conduct and democratic values, co-taught seminars on ethics and professionalism, and served together on committees working to reform legal education. Their partnership demonstrated one of Patricia's core beliefs, that former adversaries could become allies when they shared common values and commitment to growth. The restaurant incident that had seemed like such a painful setback had ultimately created opportunities for both women to contribute to their profession in ways that might never have emerged otherwise. As Patricia prepared for her 3rd year, directing the Georgetown program, she received a letter that brought everything full circle. It was from Sophie, the hostess who had been caught in the middle of the restaurant confrontation years earlier. Sophie had graduated from law school and was beginning her career as a public defender, inspired by Patricia's example of grace under pressure. "That night at Meridian's changed my life," Sophie wrote. "Watching how you responded to Judge Sterling's hostility showed me what real strength looks like. I decided to study law because I wanted to defend people who couldn't defend themselves, and I wanted to do it with the same dignity you showed that night." Patricia smiled as she read the letter, remembering the terrified young woman who had been forced to navigate an impossible situation between a federal judge and a former attorney general. The fact that Sophie had found inspiration in that difficult moment and had channeled it into a career of public service seemed like the perfect culmination of everything the incident had set in motion. The work continued, with new challenges and opportunities emerging regularly. Patricia's program had become a model for law schools around the country. Her forums had influenced how contentious legal issues were discussed in media and academic circles, and her approach to conflict resolution was being applied in contexts far beyond the legal profession. But for Patricia, the most meaningful measure of success remained the individual stories. Young lawyers like Sophie choosing careers in public service, experienced practitioners like Margaret Sterling recommitting to their highest ideals, students learning that advocacy and empathy could coexist, communities discovering that their deepest conflicts could be addressed through dialogue rather than demagoguery. The restaurant incident that had seemed like such a personal and professional crisis had become the foundation for work that was reshaping how Americans thought about disagreement, dialogue, and democratic participation. What had begun as Margaret Sterling's attempt to humiliate Patricia Valdez had evolved into a national conversation about dignity, respect, and the possibility of grace, even in the most challenging circumstances. Standing in her Georgetown office as another semester began, Patricia looked out at students hurrying across campus to their first classes of the year. Among them were future judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, corporate lawyers, and public interest advocates who would carry the lessons of civil discourse into every corner of the legal profession. The ripple effects would continue for decades, as these students became partners and leaders, as they taught their own students and mentored their own colleagues, as they applied principles of respectful engagement to cases and controversies not yet imagined. The simple choice to respond to hostility with dignity had become a legacy that would outlast any individual career or controversy. Patricia picked up her notes for the day's first class, a seminar on advanced conflict resolution techniques. The reading assignment included case studies from her own forums, examples of how even the most intractable disputes could yield to patient, respectful engagement. As she walked toward the classroom, Patricia felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work that matters, from using one's own difficult experiences to help others navigate their challenges with greater wisdom and grace. The story that had begun with a moment of intended humiliation had become a testament to the transformative power of choosing dignity over defeat, understanding over accusation, hope over cynicism. And as Patricia entered the classroom to begin another day of teaching the next generation of leaders, the story continued to unfold. One conversation, one student, one moment of grace at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.